Oops, I did it again. I play. Welcome to Module 4, Lecture 9 of Introduction to International Relations. This begins our two-lecture series on foreign policy. So, what are the factors that shape a country's foreign policy? We're going to be talking about that and looking at different models for the ways in which decision makers within a government come up with the foreign policy that their country is going to implement. So one model that we're going to talk about is the rational model. And again, this kind of relates back to some of the same ideas about decision making that we've talked about with respect to neoliberalism and neorealism and how they assume that states are rational actors. So this is very similar along those lines. It borrows from economic theory. So in the rational model, you have a very tightly constrained decision-making process. You have the setting of goals, evaluating the relative importance of each of those goals, calculating costs and benefits of each option, and then choosing the option that has the highest benefits but is accompanied with the lowest costs. And so I gave a couple of little images here of WALL-E from the popular film and the robotic representative from Parks and Rec to kind of signify that this is a very sterile and robotic sort of way of thinking about decision making, because it, as we'll see with a couple of other models, tends to ignore other factors that may encroach upon the decision making process. But in general, the rational model assumes that people are capable of making this kind of calculated decision based on a series of steps that they use to make decisions where foreign policy is concerned. An alternative to that is what's known as the organizational process model. And here, again, we're reviewing the constraints under which decision makers are going to be making their decisions. And so basically in this kind of a situation, you have standard operating procedures that are applied to the context of foreign policy decision making. So you can see this is an example not of foreign policy, but from health sciences, where you've basically got a flow chart. And there's a goal or there's a kind of an issue that might be something that people are confronted with, and then someone has the ability to follow along the various paths based on subsequent answers to questions or new information that they're provided. So think of this kind of like someone who's a telemarketer, right? They may have a standard kind of sheet that they have to abide by when they're making a cold call to a new customer. And they call someone up and they say, do you want a year's worth of magazines? And then the person says, yes, I would love a year's worth of magazines, sign me up. And so they go to the yes side of their kind of standard operating procedure chart. And then they can sign them up and all that. But then on the alternative, someone might say, no, why are you calling me during dinner time? I'm not interested in magazines or anything else, never call me again. So when someone who's on the phone is presented with that kind of a response, no, then that person follows the standard operating procedure down the no path. So the same kind of logic applies to foreign policy decision making, although of course it may not always be that simple, and when issues change in a very short period of time, you may not be able to refer to standard operating procedures for the duration of an international crisis, for example. Another different model of decision-making is known as government bargaining or a bureaucratic politics model. And this is where countries have arrived at their decisions through a mix of the interests of the state agencies that are involved in the decision-making process. So the picture that you have here is a meeting between Russia and China, and you have people across the table who are representing the various agencies, and they kind of pair up. And remember, each agency has their own decisions to make about what they want as far as advancing the goals of their agency, but also while respecting the goals of the federal government. So the idea is that you can bring together all of these disparate agencies that may have different goals, and once they kind of hash that out on a sort of a bilateral basis, then you can reach some kind of an agreement where the overriding goals of the federal government include all of these different discussions that have been going on between different ministers and their analogs in other countries. But a really important caveat to this is that it assumes that individuals are rational actors, both the individuals themselves and the state that they are representing. And this is the assumption of rationality, right, which we've talked about before, and that's where individuals or states will pursue self-interested goals. And so we assume that they want to achieve these goals and they will do things in the service of accomplishing them. That's what makes it rational. It's not rational in the sense that we think it's crazy or appropriate. It's that they follow what it is they're interested in, and then they let that guide how they decide to make decisions. But in reality, as you've probably recognized in your own life, there's lots of other factors that can come into play when making decisions. Values and beliefs tend to intrude into the decision-making process. And so this is really important to understand, and scholars in international relations have definitely paid attention to this dynamic and developed literature that speaks to how foreign policy decisions might be influenced by things outside of rational behavior. So one is misperception and selective perception. So this is the idea that we have information screens that filter out certain kinds of information. Psychological literature tells us, for example, that there's a phenomenon known as confirmation bias, where people will tend to seek out information that already verifies or validates what they already believe. And we see this play out in foreign policy decision making. For example, during the Nixon administration, President Nixon liked to keep a very small group of advisors, and in some occasions where he had members of his government and his cabinet who were informing him about their perspectives on important issues, he would discount what those people say and go back to his kind of small group or circle of trust and defer to them. And so even in the face of alternative information, occasionally some people, even presidents, have a tendency to want to listen to those with whom they already agree. And we do this on a daily basis when we absorb information that we read, whether we're looking at Facebook or watching television. We might watch certain channels because they tell us what we want to hear if we're talking about like uptake of news information and things like that. So confirmation bias is very real, and our inability to be completely neutral definitely affects our decision-making capacity. Another one is affective bias. And so this is not affective in the sense of it refers to positive or negative feelings that individuals have toward other individuals or even countries. And so whether we like it or not, that's the reality that we face when thinking about individual decision-making processes, that if a president has had a very tumultuous relationship with the president or prime minister in another country, that may affect the president's ability to make unbiased decisions, where that might be a really important thing to consider. So the way that we feel about other people, the way that we feel about other countries, that will color our ability to make decisions. And then another kind of realm of this is, generally speaking, cognitive bias, which refers to issues associated with our processing of our cognitive abilities to understand information and to not rely on shortcuts that may impair decision making. And there are several examples which I'm going to talk about really briefly. One is justification of effort. This was one that the textbook mentioned as being relevant in the case of Vietnam. And so in the instance where justification of effort is discussed, or perhaps relevant, you have, for example, in the case of Vietnam, a lot of soldiers, a lot of resources committed to the war in Vietnam, and we were losing. But the idea was, well, we can't give up now. We've already contributed so much in the way of our resources and our manpower that it would be going back on everything we've done if we were to pull out now. So you dig yourself into an even bigger hole because you feel like you've already put forth so much time and effort. And then a couple of other ones, wishful thinking. This is where the probability of an event might be very low, but people will still want to envision themselves as achieving that or being part of that very small minority or probability. And I'll just give you not an international relations example, but an example from my own working life. when I was in graduate school, I worked with lots of high school students as a side job, and I helped them to prepare their essays and SAT, and help them with their SAT tests for college admissions. And so I remember I had one student who I presented with information about the likelihood of getting into a certain school. And it was a very selective school, and I showed the student the GPA that you needed and the SAT score that you needed. And there's a range, right? There's a middle 50%, and then there's 25% on the bottom and 25% up top. So we were just talking about the middle 50% range. And I said, if you look at your GPA and your SAT score, you're at the very, very, very low end of the middle 50%. So it's very unlikely that you're going to be admitted to this school. You might want to think about applying to some other schools as well, because this could be really difficult. And the student's thinking was, well, it's still within that band of 50%, so I could be that person who gets in. That's an example of wishful thinking. The student thought that they would be the exception to the rule, not the rule itself or the average experience of students who apply to that school, and in all likelihood they were rejected by the school later on. In fact, they did attend a different university. And then finally, there's historical analogies that people bring to bear when they're trying to make decisions, and they like to think about different events throughout history and how we might learn from those lessons so that we don't make the same mistakes again. But the problem is that history is never repeats itself in the exact same way that it occurred, right? So someone who wants to look back on one historical incident and say that we should extrapolate from that exactly what we should do in the future in a different context, that might lead them to suboptimal conclusions. And so the example that the textbook gives of this is the idea that we cannot appease the Vietnamese communists because we'll be in a situation not unlike we were in 1938 in Munich when we engaged in the appeasement approach toward Adolf Hitler. But the problem was, of course, that Adolf Hitler in 1938 and the Vietnamese communists in the 1960s were completely different cultures, completely different circumstances, and the Vietnamese context had to do more with a civil war than it did with one fascist dictator who was trying to engage in ethnic cleansing. So it's not always proper to use historical analogies, especially because in many cases we're talking about a one-off event, and we want to use that event to inform our decision-making in the future, but the reality is that those two historical events may be very different in important ways. So how can we deal with the fact that there's all of these issues we may be confronted with when we think about decision-making under the context of a rational model? So one kind of approach to this is known as bounded rationality. And this is the recognition that there are limitations to our abilities to make good decisions. That's the sort of, that's why we have the word bounded, right? It's constrained by the realities of our affect and our cognitive capabilities. And so a couple of different variations of or expressions of bounded rationality are optimizing, where you try to choose the absolute best course of action given the information you have, but given the stress and the time constraints under which foreign policy decision makers operate, that's not always going to be the likely case. So what you have instead is a tendency toward what's known as satisficing. And this is where you choose the first best option, or a suitable or satisfactory option, even if it may not be the absolute best option that you're searching for. So I'll give you an example, right? Just from a personal kind of perspective. You go to Publix and you want to get a sandwich. And you're really excited about, it's the middle of the day, you're getting lunch, and you want a Publix turkey and cheese sub. But you get to Publix and you missed or you just came right after the lunch crunch and they ran out of turkey. So now you're faced with a decision, right? Either do you not get a sandwich at all? Do you use your lunch hour driving all over to different Publixes? Or do you choose a different meat or no meat at all? And so maybe you're upset that you couldn't have a turkey sub, but you're okay with having ham. So even though it's not your favorite, you're still going to buy a ham sub because you have only an hour, so you've got limited time and you can't drive all over everywhere. So you decide to get a ham sub instead. That would be an example of satisficing, because maybe it's not the optimal approach that you would have liked to take, but it's one that you're willing to deal with. It's the kind of first next alternative after what you really wanted to do. And then there's another alternative, which is known as prospect theory, and this is where decision making occurs in two different phases. In the first phase, it's called editing, and this is where someone evaluates the probabilities of different kinds of events occurring given different courses of action. And then in the second phase, known as evaluation, the decision makers will compare those probabilities and figure out which one they want to go with based on the information that they have. So it's this two-step process in which there's costs and benefits that are evaluated and decisions made based on probabilities. Another relevant phenomenon that happens in foreign policy decision-making circumstances is what is known as groupthink. And this is the tendency for groups to reach decisions without accurately assessing their consequences because individual members tend to go along with ideas they think the others support. There's a really famous psychological study that kind of demonstrates this, in which people were looking at two different arrows, right? And we may have seen this before on Facebook or something, where there's one arrow that has the ends inward, and then there's another arrow where the ends are outward. So it looks like they might be two different sizes. And what they found is, so the rub is really that both of these lines, these arrows, are exactly the same length, but because of the kind of illusion created by the position of the little greater than or less than signs, some people might think that they're not the same size. And what psychologists have demonstrated is that in a room where people are making decisions about this, and there's a confederate brought in who basically tries to steer the discussion away from what people even think is true, that brings more people on board, and it tends to polarize groups. People will recognize they don't want to be left out of the decision-making process. They don't want to feel like they're an outsider, so they have a tendency in these group settings to go along with more extreme positions, even if they might not be valid or they may contradict the perspective of the person themselves. So what we're going to watch is a brief video from the Council on Foreign Relations that discusses this phenomenon known as groupthink in the context of one of the more famous examples in which groupthink was likely relevant, and that is the Bay of Pigs crisis in Cuba during the Kennedy administration. So let's take a look at that video, and then we'll finish up with the rest of the lecture.
Imagine you're President of the United States. Your advisors come to you with a plan to overthrow a hostile government that threatens American security. The plan would solve a major problem if it worked, but you worry that it won't. What do you do? I'm Jim Lindsay, and this is Lessons Learned. Our topic today is the Bay of Pigs invasion, which began on April 17, 1961. The road to the Bay of Pigs began 2 years earlier when Fidel Castro overthrew Cuba's U.S.-backed dictator, Fulgencio Batista. Relations between the two countries quickly soured. Castro denounced decades of U.S. political and economic domination of Cuba. He called for revolutions throughout Latin America, and he seized properties that U.S. firms owned in Cuba. What especially worried Washington, though, was Castro's growing ties to Moscow. It was the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union looked to be on the march around the globe. So President Dwight Eisenhower and his advisors looked at Castro in fear that the Soviets would soon have a beachhead less than 100 miles off America's shores. By March 1960, Eisenhower had had enough. He authorized a CIA plan to train Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. The plan, eventually codenamed Bumpy Road, rested on the premise that the attack by Cuban exiles would trigger a popular uprising in Cuba that would overthrow Castro. Eisenhower had reason to be confident that the plan would work. 6 years earlier, the Central Intelligence Agency had engineered the ouster of a leftist government in Guatemala. Operation Bumpy Road could not be executed before Eisenhower left office. The decision on whether to proceed was left to his successor, John F. Kennedy. JFK had doubts about the wisdom of Operation Bumpy Road. He knew that a decision to intervene overtly in Cuba would be criticized at home and especially abroad. But he also knew that ousting Castro would fulfill his campaign promise of a tougher foreign policy and strengthen his hand in dealing with the Soviets. And he saw a real political cost to killing the operation. some of the hundreds of Cuban exiles, and probably a few U.S. government officials as well, would complain to the press that he had walked away from the plan that would have toppled Castro. That would have exposed JFK to damaging charges that he was soft on communism. So JFK gave a green light to Operation Bumpy Road, but in doing so he made two critical decisions. First, because he wanted to minimize overt U.S. involvement, he severely limited the U.S. air support for the mission. CIA and U.S. Air Force officials went along with the restriction because they assumed he would change his mind if the operation ran into trouble. Second, he chose a more remote landing site for the operation, the Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. Unfortunately, it was a lousy spot for an amphibious landing. The invasion force of 1,511 exiles, known as Brigade 2506, landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. The operation was a disaster from the start. Castro's army wasn't surprised, ordinary Cubans did not rise up in revolt, and JFK refused to send the U.S. military to save the Cuban exiles pinned down on the beaches. On April 19th, Brigade 2506 surrendered. The 3 days of fighting had left 140 exiles dead and nearly 1,200 captured.
On that unhappy island, as in so many other arenas of the contest for freedom, the news has grown worse instead of better. I have emphasized before that this was a struggle of Cuban patriots against a Cuban dictator. While we could not be expected to hide our sympathies, we made it repeatedly clear that the armed forces of this country would not intervene in any way.
The Bay of Pigs is one of the biggest U.S. foreign policy fiascos of the 20th century. There are many reasons it failed besides JFK's refusal to authorize air support. The underlying premise that ordinary Cubans would come to the invasion's aid was flatly wrong. The invasion was poorly organized and managed. It also wasn't much of a secret or a surprise to Castro. The New York Times ran two separate stories on its front page about the U.S. efforts to train a Cuban army in exile. What is the lesson of the Bay of Pigs? Just this: be prepared for failure and plan accordingly. JFK had doubts about the wisdom of the CIA's plan, and he knew that he would not order a direct U.S. military intervention. So he put all of his eggs in hoping that Operation Bumpy Road would work. It didn't. Had JFK thought through the possibilities of failure, he might have canceled the operation or fundamentally reshaped it. As it was, he was left to lament, "How could I have been so stupid to let them go ahead?" Presidents don't want to find themselves asking JFK's question about their own decisions. So recognizing the potential for failure and taking steps to minimize it is a fundamental challenge for all types of foreign policy making. But it is especially important when talking about decisions to use military force. To take just one example, it is fine to discuss how military strikes might blunt Iran's nuclear ambitions, but that analysis is incomplete unless it also grapples with how a military strike might fail or create an entirely new set of problems to handle. So here's a question to consider. What steps should presidents take to make sure that they are thinking through how their policies might fail rather than simply engaging in wishful thinking about how they will succeed? I encourage you to weigh in with your answers on my blog, The Water's Edge. You can find it at cfr.org. I'm Jim Lindsay. Thank you for watching this installment of Lessons Learned.
Welcome back. So we're going to wrap up the lecture by talking a little bit about the domestic influences that affect foreign policy decision making. And there are a bunch of different groups that we're going to discuss briefly, the first of which are bureaucracies, and these consist of diplomats and the various government agencies that all have maybe some role to play in the way that foreign policy is enacted. And so in the United States context, for example, you have lots of agencies that may have some kind of interface with international issues like the Department of Commerce, the Department of Energy. So the people working in those agencies will certainly want to have a say in how policy is dictated, and their influence will go up the chain and potentially affect decisions made at higher levels. And diplomats, whether we're talking about consulates or ambassadors, will be responsible for policy related to the country that they are representing and or working in, and so they can also influence the process through the channels that they have in those host countries or in the home country itself. There are also lots of interest groups, domestically speaking, that may have some kind of influence on the foreign policy decision-making process. These include, farmers if we're talking about international trade issues, or labor unions if we're talking about economic and worker-related issues that may be relevant to people who could be affected working in the United States, senior citizens, environmentalists, teachers. There's lots of different groups that lobby elected officials to influence their decision making. Another, which was a term popularized by Dwight Eisenhower, is the military-industrial complex. And this is a whole network of government agencies, institutions, private actors that work to provide resources for our armed services. And so, for example, there was a book that I read years ago called Virtual War, and it talks about the role of, among other things, video game designers who are working in Florida to help provide training programs for the U.S. military. And when I was a kid, every once in a while we would get sent a DVD of a video game from the Air Force or from the Army that was made probably by a video game design company in Florida that makes these kinds of training programs for the military, but they're also using it as recruitment tools. So these kinds of private agencies are just one part of the military-industrial complex. But if you think about representatives who represent districts that have a military base or lots of veterans, they can certainly care a great deal about the way in which foreign policy may affect our military forces. So everything from the companies that manufacture tanks and airplanes and bulletproof vests to the elected officials who represent these districts where there are lots of military personnel, to companies that are designing video games, to, like, for example, in Jacksonville, we have the Wounded Warrior Project. They certainly are going to care a great deal about how government policy is going to affect the military. And so this whole array of actors may bring to bear some influence on the decision-making processes of people in leadership roles. There's also public opinion. This kind of gets back to what we talked about in several lectures ago about national will, and also, to a certain extent, credible commitments. Because, especially in a democracy, public opinion can drive decision-making. If someone knows that what they're going to do is incredibly unpopular with their citizenry, then they may get some blowback on the electoral end because either themselves or their party might be negatively affected in the next round of elections. So public opinion can be a very powerful tool for driving the influence that ultimately winds up resulting in some kind of foreign policy decisions. And then legislatures, although it kind of goes without saying, right? We have the Senate Armed Services Committee. We have members of our elected positions who came from military backgrounds, right? Senator John McCain, for example. And so the people who are occupying the positions of authority within the federal government make decisions all the time about where we deploy our troops, or how much resources are we going to commit this year in an annual budget. So legislatures can definitely, on the domestic side, have a strong influence in the way that foreign policy decisions are made, not the least of which, including issues relating to the military, but also about aid that we provide other countries. The United States provides a lot of foreign assistance for countries all throughout the world, but also predominantly in places like the Middle East. We spend less money in Africa. So those kinds of decisions are made by legislators, and they will have an impact on foreign policy decisions.